Have you ever found yourself watching the news, seeing countries interact on the global stage? Maybe they're signing a big trade agreement. Maybe they're having a heated exchange at the UN. Perhaps one is imposing sanctions or, taking a strong military stance and wondered, why that move? What's really driving that country to behave this way right now?
Yeah, and why is that other country reacting in precisely that manner?
Yeah.
It often feels like there's a complex sort of underlying logic at play, doesn't it?
Exactly. A set of fundamental principles guiding these actions that aren't always obvious on the surface.
You've hit on something crucial there. There absolutely is a foundational logic. States aren't just acting randomly. Their behaviors are rooted in core concepts that have been studied for centuries in the field of international relations.
Right.
Understanding these concepts is really the key to unlocking a deeper comprehension of global affairs.
And that's exactly what we're going to do today. Our mission in this deep dive is to unpack those essential concepts, foreign policy and national interest. We're going to be drawing directly from a really solid foundation in this area, specifically insights found in Viancana's International Relations 5th edition.
A key text, yeah.
Think of this as getting a direct line to the fundamental mechanics of how states operate in the international arena. We'll break down exactly what foreign policy is, define what's meant by national interest, explore how these two are intrinsically connected, and perhaps most importantly, examine the incredibly varied and interacting factors that shape them.
It's about seeing the blueprint and the motivation behind a state's interactions with the rest of the world. It provides that essential context you were just talking about.
Okay, let's dive straight into the concept of foreign policy itself. Our source material right away uses a very helpful analogy, describing foreign policy and diplomacy as the wheels,
Right.
sort of, with which the process of international relations operates.
And that's a wonderfully illustrative way to put it. I mean, imagine the complex machinery of global interactions, trade flows, cultural exchanges, political negotiations, alliances, rivalries. None of that happens in a vacuum, right?
Right.
States, just by their very nature as entities existing alongside other states, they have to engage. Even historically, long before modern globalization, interactions occurred. These interactions require deliberate choices about, how to engage, how to present oneself, what to seek, what to avoid. Foreign policy is that operational mechanism.
Right. And the core purpose driving this engagement, this use of the wheels, the source is unequivocal. Every state, just like any individual or any organized entity, is fundamentally driven by the desire to promote its own well-being, its own advantage. These are what we term national interests.
Precisely. And this is a critical point. Foreign policy is not an end in itself. It is a means. It is specifically formulated, designed, and implemented with the explicit overriding purpose of serving and advancing these national interests.
So governments, when they're deciding how to act towards other states, or even deciding not to act, are making choices based on what they perceive to be in the best interest of their nation.
Exactly. It's all about that perception of interest.
Which brings us to a straightforward definition offered in our source by Professor Mahendra Kumar. He states that the study of this behavior is, broadly speaking, the content of foreign policy. It's about analyzing the patterns and decisions behind how governments interact with the external world.
And the goal of this behavior isn't just passive coexistence, is it? The primary purpose, as the source highlights, is active. It's to seek adjustments in the behavior of other states in one's own favor.
In one's own favor, right, because inevitably the actions of one state have repercussions and effects on others.
Absolutely. So a state uses its foreign policy to try and shape that external environment to its advantage.
Okay, let's look at some of the different definitions presented in the source because they each offer a slightly different emphasis, helping us build, a fuller picture. Medelsky, for example, defines foreign policy as the system of activities evolved by communities for changing the behavior of other states and for adjusting their own activities to the international environment.
Medelsky really zeroes in on the idea of attempting to change the behavior of others. For him, a key aspect of foreign policy is the effort a state makes to alter what another state is doing or planning to do.
Right.
He sees the study of foreign policy as shedding light on these attempts and, crucially, their success or failure.
And the source gives us some compelling historical examples of states trying to do just that and, well, not always succeeding, like India back in the day trying to persuade established nuclear powers to agree on a clear timetable for nuclear disarmament.
A very ambitious goal, that. And as the source notes, it ultimately failed to change the behavior of those major powers in the way India desired.
Didn't work out.
Another example given is the United States attempting to persuade India to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT.
The NPT, that's the cornerstone treaty aimed at preventing the spread of nuclear weapons and technology, promoting peaceful uses, and working towards disarmament, right?
That's the one. And in that instance, the source points out, the U.S. attempt to change India's behavior on signing the treaty also failed at that time.
So these examples clearly show that while changing behavior is an aim of foreign policy, the attempt doesn't guarantee success. Not by a long shot.
Absolutely. Hugh Gibson provides a definition that brings in the element of deliberate planning. He describes foreign policy as a well-rounded, comprehensive plan based on knowledge and experience for conducting the business of government with the rest of the world.
It is aimed at promoting and protecting the interests of the nation. That sounds much more strategic, less reactive. It emphasizes the foresight and the explicit goal of safeguarding national interests.
Definitely. And Northedge adds another critical layer, seeing foreign policy as an interaction between forces originating outside the country's borders and those working within them.
This is vital, isn't it? Because it reminds us that foreign policy isn't made in a vacuum, dictated purely by external events.
No, not at all. It's a product of both international pressures and dynamics and the internal conditions, values, politics, everything going on within a country. It's a constant negotiation between the outside and the inside.
And Hartman offers a very concise definition, cutting right to the chase. He defines foreign policy as a systematic statement of deliberately selected national interests.
Again, highlighting that link between the policy and the fundamental interests it seeks to serve. Very direct.
So across these varying perspectives, a clear common thread emerges, doesn't it? Foreign policy fundamentally involves state behavior.
Yes. Behavior that is deliberate, planned to varying degrees, and aimed at managing a state's own actions in the international environment, while also, if possible, influencing or regulating the behavior of other states.
And the ultimate driver, the underlying motivation, is always the perceived national interest.
Always comes back to that.
Now, returning to Medelsky's specific emphasis on changing behavior, our source presents an important critique from Professor Mahendra Kumar. Kumar argues that simply focusing on changing behavior is too narrow a view.
And he makes a very good point. While changing behavior is certainly an aim, it's not the only aim. Kumar notes that sometimes a state might not want another state's behavior to change at all. It might want to ensure the continuation of existing behavior that serves its interests.
Or maybe it needs to change itself.
Exactly. Or a state might realize that it needs to make adjustments in its own behavior in response to the international landscape or the actions of others, rather than trying to force others to change.
So Kumar proposes a broader, more encompassing goal. The aim of foreign policy, he argues, should be to regulate, not merely to change, the behavior of other states.
Right. He defines regulation in this context as adjusting the behavior of other states to suit one's own interest as best as possible.
Okay, regulation. That distinction is important. Regulation implies a wider spectrum of desired outcomes than just change.
It really does. It includes encouraging beneficial existing behaviors, preventing detrimental changes, or even accepting a less than ideal behavior but seeking to channel or contain its effects in a way that minimizes harm or maximizes residual benefit for oneself.
The source uses the Cold War again to illustrate this. While the superpowers, the US and the USSR, often tried to alter states' ideologies or alliances to pull them into their respective blocs.
India, during that same period, wasn't necessarily trying to fundamentally change the internal systems of most countries. Instead, it sought to regulate their behavior in the international system, encouraging a stance of neutrality, independence, non-alignment.
To build that non-aligned movement, yeah.
To build a movement that suited India's interest in maintaining its own autonomy and leveraging relationships with both blocs. It was about regulating their external posture.
That makes the concept of regulation much clearer, like the U.S. containment policy, for instance. It wasn't just about changing the USSR's behavior inside its borders, but regulating its outward expansion and influence.
To prevent a change in the global balance that the U.S. saw as detrimental to its interests.
Exactly.
And the effort in 1996 to regulate India's behavior regarding endorsing the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, CTBT.
Which is that international agreement prohibiting all nuclear explosions for both civilian and military purposes.
Thanks. That effort was an attempt by certain states to regulate India's stance on nuclear testing and non-proliferation, wasn't it? To bring it in line with their preferred international norms.
It was about regulating behavior, not necessarily trying to change something fundamental about India itself. That's a good example.
And the source adds another important layer, drawing on the insights of Felix Gross. He points out that even a deliberate decision not to engage or not to have relations with a particular state is, in itself, a foreign policy decision. That's fascinating, right? It's about consciously choosing the degree of involvement that best serves a state's perceived national interests. Non-action as action.
So India's decision back in 1949, based on its values and interests, not to establish diplomatic relations with the apartheid regime in South Africa, that was a calculated foreign policy choice. A decision for non-engagement as a form of policy.
Absolutely. Similarly, the United States' decision for many years after the Bolshevik Revolution not to recognize the Soviet Union until 1934, that wasn't an absence of policy. It was a very clear, deliberate policy of non-recognition rooted in specific perceived interests at the time.
It demonstrates that foreign policy isn't solely defined by active diplomacy or engagement. It also encompasses deliberate withdrawal, non-recognition, or maintaining a cool distance when that posture is deemed most beneficial.
Exactly. Which leads to this useful distinction the source mentions, positive versus negative foreign policy.
Right. Positive policy aims at regulating behavior, primarily by changing it, while negative policy aims at regulation by not changing behavior, maybe maintaining a status quo or a specific non-relationship.
It's about whether the policy seeks to actively alter the external environment or to preserve aspects of it, or maybe even insulate oneself from it.
So putting it all together then, foreign policy involves a state consciously adopting a set of principles and a general orientation to guide its relations with the rest of the world. This is fundamentally based on the interaction between the state's perceived national interests, the ends it wants to achieve, and the means it possesses to achieve those ends, which primarily involve its power.
And that's precisely captured by the quote from Bandopasya in the source. The formulation of foreign policy is essentially an exercise in the choice of ends and means on the part of a nation-state in an international setting.
It's a powerful distillation of the concept, isn't it? It's about a state looking at what it wants in the world, the ends, and assessing what tools and capabilities it has, the means, to try and get there.
And the process of making those choices and deciding on the actions is the essence of foreign policy. And that international setting part is crucial because it's not an isolated decision. It's made in a complex environment where other states are doing the exact same calculation.
Okay, so if foreign policy is the dynamic process, the wheels, and it's about matching ends and means, let's really focus on that central end, national interest. The source makes it absolutely clear that national interest is the driving force, the absolute keynote of international relations.
It's presented as a kind of fundamental axiom of state behavior almost. The idea that self-interest is not only a legitimate, but a fundamental cause for national policy. It's seen not just as permissible, but as the inherent duty of a government.
A government is expected to prioritize and pursue the interests of its own nation above all else. That's the job description, essentially.
Pretty much. This perspective is very much rooted in realist thinking in international relations, perhaps most famously associated with Hans Morgenthau. Our source quotes Morgenthau saying that as long as the world is structured into nation-states, national interest is the last word in world politics.
The last word. That's a strong claim, isn't it?
It really is. It suggests that no matter what a state's ideology might be, democratic, socialist, authoritarian, whatever, no matter what noble ideals it might proclaim on the international stage, when push comes to shove, its foreign policy decisions will, and arguably must, ultimately be guided by its own perceived national interest.
To do otherwise would be seen as a failure of governmental responsibility from that perspective.
Exactly. And this pragmatic, often, let's say, unsentimental view of state behavior is echoed across history by prominent statesmen. Take Lord Palmerston, the 19th century British Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister. His famous quote is included, "We have no eternal allies, and we have no eternal enemies. Our interests are eternal, and those interests it is our duty to follow."
That quote is a classic for a reason. It perfectly encapsulates the idea that relationships between states are not based on sentiment or permanent loyalty, but on alignment of interests.
Absolutely. Friendship or enmity can shift dramatically as national interests converge or diverge. When interests clash, states must find a way to manage that divergence, whether through negotiation, compromise, or sometimes, unfortunately, confrontation. Palmerston was essentially saying, look, forget sentimentality, focus on what truly benefits the nation in the long run.
And going back even further, George Washington, in his farewell address, offered similar counsel to the nascent United States, calling it a universal truth that no country can be trusted further than it is bound by its interests.
And no prudent statesman or politician will venture to depart from it. This adds another layer. a degree of inherent caution in international dealings.
Yeah, it implies that a wise leader understands that other nations, too, are primarily driven by their own interests and trusts them only to the extent that those interests overlap with one's own. Don't be naive, basically.
Right, so if national interest is this fundamental, eternal driving force, how exactly do we define it? What does it comprise? The source provides several perspectives that help flesh this out. It's described broadly as the general and continuing ends for which a nation acts.
Kind of the long-term goals.
Yeah. Bandapatiya offers a foundational element, stating that every state aims at preserving its political independence and territorial integrity by safeguarding its international boundaries. This is presented as almost the baseline requirement for a state's existence and thus a universal core national interest.
Survival, first and foremost. Spikeman reinforces this, arguing that self-preservation means defending control over one's territory and maintaining independent status. He's quoted saying, "The basic objective of the foreign policy of all states is the preservation of territorial integrity and political independence."
The absolute bedrock upon which all other interests are built. You can't pursue other goals if you don't exist as an independent entity.
True. Paddleford and Lincoln expand the definition slightly, suggesting that national interests are centered on core values of the society. These core values include the welfare of the nation, the security of its political beliefs, national way of life, territorial integrity, and its self-preservation.
This is a crucial expansion, I think. It brings in the internal dimension, protecting not just the physical state, but also its fundamental character, its political system, its societal values, from external threat or undue influence. It's about preserving who you are, not just where you are.
Robert Osgood gives a more concise, functional definition. State of affairs values solely for its benefit to the nations. Just, is it good for us?
Very straightforward. And Morgenthau, again, emphasizes the protective aspect, safeguarding the state's physical safety, its political independence, and its cultural identity against external threats. Foreign policymakers ignore these requirements at their nation's peril.
So, distilling these points, the source identifies certain components that are generally considered essential elements of national interest. First and foremost, security.
Unquestionably the primary concern, the defense and survival of the state and its people. Non-negotiable, really.
Secondly, economic development. This includes ensuring favorable conditions for trade, access to resources, and policies that promote the nation's economic well-being.
Yeah, a nation's economic health is inextricably linked to its stability, its capacity to provide for its citizens, and its ability to project power internationally. So securing economic advantage is a fundamental interest. You need the resources to function.
And thirdly, perhaps a bit more nuanced than pure self-preservation or economic gain, the source mentions pursuing a peaceful world order. This includes elements like international peace, respect for international law, the peaceful settlement of disputes, and strengthening international organizations.
This component recognizes that in an increasingly interconnected world, a degree of global stability and cooperation can itself be a national interest. I mean, a chaotic, lawless international system is detrimental to most states in the long run, right? So working towards a more orderly one can paradoxically serve a nation's self-interest, particularly when you're dealing with things like, climate change or pandemics, transnational challenges.
Now, here's where things can get tricky, and the source introduces a really important point. What happens when a government, the people making foreign policy decisions, has a wrong or misplaced belief about what actually constitutes the country's national interests?
This is a critical caveat, and the source is quite direct. Policies based on a flawed perception of national interests are described as bound to fail in the long run, but, and this is the key part, the leader or government in power will still pursue them because they believe they're acting in the nation's best interest.
The perception, however inaccurate, becomes the driver.
Exactly. This is where we see how political leaders or powerful domestic groups can significantly shape or even manipulate the definition of national interest being pursued. They frame their goals, which might serve their own power or ideology, as being essential for the nation's welfare.
And the historical examples provided are stark demonstrations of this. Napoleon's disastrous campaigns, like the invasion of Russia or the final defeat at Waterloo, he undoubtedly framed these expansions and wars as serving France's glory and power, France's national interest, as he saw it.
But the outcome was ultimately catastrophic for France, suggesting his perception was deeply flawed. Or take Hitler's expansionist policies in the 1930s and 40s. The annexation of Austria, the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, These were justified to the German people and framed internally as necessary steps for Germany's security, its Lebensraum, its rightful place in the world.
All presented as being in the ultimate German national interest.
Of course. But these policies led directly to the Second World War and the utter devastation of Germany. The perceived interest was disastrously wrong.
Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement towards Hitler in the late 1930s is another classic example mentioned. From Chamberlain's perspective, avoiding another major war seemed profoundly in Britain's national interest after the horrors of WWI. He perceived appeasement as the way to secure peace in our time.
But history showed this perception was tragically mistaken. It emboldened Hitler and made the eventual war even more costly. Then you have Stalin installing friendly communist governments across Eastern Europe after 1945.
The buffer zone.
Right? From Stalin's vantage point, creating this buffer zone of satellite states was a vital security interest for the Soviet Union, protecting it from future invasion from the West. This perception heavily shaped Soviet foreign policy for decades, but it also generated immense resentment and instability in the long run.
A more recent example cited is the Pakistan government's perceived interest in destabilizing Jammu and Kashmir, pursuing policies that they frame as serving Pakistan's national goals, but which have contributed to decades of conflict and instability in the region.
In each of these cases, Napoleon, Hitler, Chamberlain, Stalin, Pakistan, the leaders were pursuing what they believed was the national interest, often justifying aggressive or controversial policies under that banner.
But the outcome proved the perception was flawed, or based on a narrow, ultimately self-defeating view.
These examples, however, are presented as exceptions apart from the norm. The source emphasizes that a normal, well-thought-out foreign policy is based on a genuine, considered perception of the country's true goals, objectives, and underlying interests. Leaders typically try to define national interest effectively, even if the complex reality sometimes leads them astray.
Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, is quoted reflecting this more standard approach. He spoke about the art of conducting foreign affairs being about finding what is most advantageous to the country, explicitly stating this should be the guiding principle, regardless of the country's ideological leaning, whether it's imperialist, socialist, or communist.
The focus is consistently on the practical advantage to the nation, what works for us.
However, the source does acknowledge a counterview, which it labels as exceptional and not widely held by practicing statesmen, the idealist perspective. Woodrow Wilson, the American president during WWI, is the most prominent figure representing this view.
Right. Wilson famously argued against basing foreign policy solely on self-interest. He's quoted saying, "It is perilous to determine the foreign policy of a nation in terms of national interest. We dare not turn from the principle that morality and not expediency is the thing that must guide us. We have no selfish ends to serve."
That's a profoundly different emphasis, isn't it? It suggests that foreign policy should be guided by universal moral principles, by what is right, rather than what is merely expedient or advantageous to one's own nation.
It's a very noble idea. Mahatma Gandhi is also mentioned in this context as someone who consistently insisted on morality in all spheres, including international dealings. The example given is his push for India to pay Pakistan its share of assets after independence based on moral obligation, even amidst hostilities.
It's a powerful ethical stance. But the source is careful to point out that Gandhi was never in a position of governmental power, and this idealist view is presented as exceptional and not generally shared by statesmen.
And there's a pragmatic reason for that, returning to our earlier points. The core duties of a statesman, as traditionally understood, involve ensuring the security and welfare of their own citizens.
Their primary responsibility.
Exactly. While morality can and should influence the means employed or the long-term vision of national interest, perhaps a peaceful world order is seen as morally good and pragmatically beneficial, basing day-to-day policy solely on abstract universal morality, potentially at the expense of the nation's security or survival, is a path most leaders feel they cannot take.
The tension between national interest and universal morality, that's a constant theme in international relations, isn't it?
It absolutely is a fundamental dilemma.
Okay, so we have foreign policy as the process, national interest as the driving end, the fundamental goal. What about the essential means used to pursue those ends? The source identifies this unequivocally as power.
Power, described as a pervasive phenomenon, something present in all forms of relationships, including, of course, the complex relationships between states. It's a capability that allows a state to try and achieve its foreign policy objectives, to translate its desired ends into reality.
How do we define this crucial concept of power in the context of international relations? The source offers several definitions, highlighting different aspects, but they all seem to converge on a central idea: the ability or capacity to control others and get them to do what one wants them to do, and also to see that they do not do what one does not want them to do.
It's about influence and control. Going back to ancient statecraft, Kautilya in his Arthashastra saw power as possession of strength, deriving from factors like knowledge, military capability, and valor.
And Hans Morgenthau, the realist, famously viewed international politics fundamentally as a struggle for power among states. For him, power was the central concept, defined as man's control over minds and actions of other men.
Professor Mahendra Kumar defines state power in this context as the ability of a state to make its will prevail and to enforce respect and command obedience from other states. It's about making your intentions effective in getting others to comply.
Robert Dahl's definition is perhaps the most stripped down and behavioral, isn't it? A has power over B to the extent that A can get B to do something that B would not otherwise do.
Purely focused on the observable outcome, changing another actor's behavior from its default course. Simple, but powerful.
And the source explicitly connects this back to foreign policy. This ability to influence, control, or command is what allows states to formulate and, crucially, successfully implement their foreign policies.
Absolutely. Without some degree of power, the capability to affect outcomes a state's foreign policy would likely remain merely aspirational, wouldn't it? Just a list of desires without the means to achieve them.
Since foreign policy is aimed at regulating the behavior of other states to serve one's own interest, having the necessary capabilities, the power, is absolutely indispensable for making that policy effective in the real world.
That's precisely it.
There's an interesting layer added by Vernon van Dijk, also mentioned in the source. He concludes that power functions in a dual role. It is both the capstone among the objectives which the states pursue and the cornerstone among the methods which they employ.
That's a great way to put it. It suggests that while power is the primary means used to achieve national interests like security or economic gain, increasing a state's power or relative standing on the world stage can often become an end in itself.
So states want power to get things, but they also just want more power.
Often, yes. States frequently seek more power, not just for a specific immediate goal, but because greater power provides greater flexibility, security, and opportunity to achieve future or undefined interests. It's kind of a self-reinforcing dynamic. More power makes it easier to get even more power.
Coulomis and Wolff provide a useful umbrella concept for power, defining it broadly as anything that establishes and maintains the control of actor A over actor B. They break down this control mechanism into three key ingredients or forms.
Okay, first, authority. This is perhaps the softest form. It's where actor B voluntarily complies with actor A's wishes, not out of coercion, but out of respect, affection, legitimacy, or sense of obligation.
So like cultural influence
Or
or moral standing.
Exactly. Think of the influence a state might have through its cultural appeal, its moral standing, or the perceived legitimacy of its institutions or actions in the eyes of others. Soft power, essentially.
Secondly, influence. This involves the use of persuasion to get a reluctant actor B to accept actor A's wishes.
Right. It's about leveraging resources, diplomatic skill, economic incentives, think aid, trade deals, or disincentives like sanctions, to sway another state's decision-making without outright coercion. It's the realm of carrots and sticks, negotiation and bargaining.
And thirdly, force. This is the most direct and hardest form, coercion.
Yep. It involves actor A compelling actor B's compliance through the use of force short of war, like a blockade, or the explicit threat of force. Military capability is the most obvious component here, but economic coercion can also fall under this umbrella if it's presented as a direct compulsion.
So a state's overall power profile can be a complex mix of these elements. Its diplomatic skill, its economic clout, its cultural attractiveness, its military might, and the perceived legitimacy of its actions.
And it uses this combination of authority, influence, and force its power as the means to pursue its national interest by changing, adjusting, or regulating the behavior of other states.
Exactly. Power is the engine oil and the mechanics, national interest is the destination, and foreign policy is the act of driving the vehicle through the traffic of international relations.
Well put.
So we've established a relationship. Foreign policy is the process, national interest is the goal, and power is the means. But what determines what a country's national interest is perceived to be in the first place? How its foreign policy is formulated, and what kind of power it possesses?
Right. What shapes the whole equation?
The source makes it clear that foreign policymaking is a dynamic process, constantly responding to events, but the underlying principles and orientation often remain surprisingly stable over time.
And this stability comes from the fact that these are shaped by numerous factors, many of which are relatively static or change only very slowly.
It's not a simple calculation done in a vacuum. Paddleford and Lincoln are quoted emphasizing this complexity, describing foreign policy as being compounded out of many factors and forces that constantly interact with each other.
A real web of influences. Medelsky's input-output model is mentioned again, actions from the community, domestic forces being the input that policymakers process to produce foreign policy outputs.
And Mahendra Kumar's components, policymakers, interest objectives, principles, and means highlight the internal elements involved.
And Appadurai and Northedge crucially highlight the interaction between the two main environments shaping policy, the domestic environment within the country and the international environment outside its borders.
The inside versus the outside.
Exactly. Forces originating from within a country interact with forces from outside. This internal-external dynamic is fundamental to understanding foreign policy decisions.
Let's really unpack the specific determinants highlighted in the source, because this is where we see the complex web at play. First, and described as a basic determinant, is geographical situation.
Geography. Destiny, as the old saying goes, though perhaps not entirely destiny, but it is certainly a foundational factor. This includes things like a state's sheer size, its climate, its topography like mountains, rivers, or coastlines acting as natural barriers or arteries.
Whether its territory is compact or fragmented, and most importantly, its location relative to other states and key resources or sea lanes, where you are matters.
Immensely. The source provides clear examples. Poland, historically situated on a plain without strong natural barriers, has faced repeated invasions and security challenges throughout its history, which fundamentally shaped its foreign policy towards alliances and defense.
Britain's island status, separated from continental Europe by water, historically provided a degree of insulation, didn't it? Allowing it to develop its sea power and engage with Europe selectively, often playing the role of a balancer.
Definitely. Although, as the source notes, the advent of air power and missiles kind of reduced the protective value of that water barrier over time.
The United States, with its vast continental territory bordered by two major oceans, benefited immensely from this geographic isolation for a long period. It allowed it to focus inward and grow before becoming a global power.
And its geographic position protected it from direct attack during crucial periods like World War II, enabling it to become the arsenal of democracy, a huge advantage.
India's strategic location in South Asia positions it as a major regional power, influencing its relationships with its neighbors and its role in Indian Ocean affairs.
And the sheer size and large populations of countries like Russia, China, and India are also geographic factors, contributing to their potential power and strategic depth, though. As the source points out, population size alone isn't a sole measure of strength, of course.
And the counterexample of Israel is relevant again here, a small country with a relatively small population in a volatile region, yet it has consistently pursued a highly effective and often aggressive foreign policy.
Which demonstrates that while geography is fundamental, factors like national resolve, military efficiency, strategic alliances, leadership,
Yeah.
they can, to some extent, mitigate geographic disadvantages. It's not purely deterministic.
Okay, secondly, history and traditions. A nation's past experiences and its deeply ingrained values and traditions significantly influence its worldview and policy choices.
Absolutely. History provides a memory bank, doesn't it? A record of successes, failures, alliances, conflicts that shapes how present-day threats and opportunities are perceived.
The historical ties between the U.S. and Britain, for example, stemming from shared heritage and evolving into a close alliance, that's a result of history.
Definitely. For India, the experience of British imperialism and the struggle for independence profoundly shaped its early foreign policy, leading to a strong empathy and support for anti-colonial movements across Asia and Africa, and a firm stance against racial discrimination internationally. That comes directly from their historical experience.
And traditional values passed down through generations also play a powerful role. A foreign minister doesn't operate in a vacuum. Their policy choices are constrained and guided by the fundamental values held by their society, right?
Absolutely. The deep-rooted democratic values in the United States, for instance, or the principle of secularism enshrined in India's constitution, are core traditions that inform and limit potential foreign policy directions. A policy seen as fundamentally violating these values would face significant domestic opposition.
Thirdly, raw materials, natural resources, and economic development. These are inescapable determinants. A country's political strength and its ability to act on the world stage are often closely tied to its economic strength and resource endowment.
Yeah, a weak industrial base or reliant on external resources can severely limit foreign policy options. Access to vital resources like energy, minerals, food, or the ability to produce them domestically, that's a major factor.
Countries that are major producers or exporters of critical resources, like the oil-rich nations of the Middle East, they gain significant political leverage, don't they? Fundamentally shaping their foreign policies and making them central actors in international energy politics.
Absolutely. Clemenceau's cynical remark during WWI that one drop of oil is worth one drop of blood of our soldiers really highlighted the perceived strategic importance of resources, even back then.
India's situation after independence, needing foreign aid and technology to build its economy, is a good example of how economic needs shape foreign policy.
It is. The source notes that India's policy of non-alignment wasn't just about ideology. It was also a pragmatic way to secure assistance from both the Western and Soviet blocs, leveraging the Cold War competition for its own economic development goals.
Makes sense. Countries manufacturing armaments, for instance, will have different economic interests and foreign policy imperatives compared to those reliant on exporting agricultural products. It shapes your outlook.
Completely. Fourthly, national morale. While perhaps less tangible than geography or economics, national morale, unity, and social cohesion are presented as significant assets contributing to a successful foreign policy.
So, a society that is unified, has high confidence, and is willing to make sacrifices for perceived national goals presents a strong front to the world.
That's the idea. Conversely, a country riddled with sharp internal divisions, whether along lines of wealth, class, community, ethnicity, is at a disadvantage. Such divisions can weaken the government's authority, divert resources inward, make the country vulnerable to external manipulation, and generally reduce its capacity to project a coherent and effective foreign policy. Social cohesion provides resilience.
Fifthly, political organization, tradition, structure, and leadership. The nature of a country's political system, is it democratic, authoritarian, parliamentary, presidential, its institutional strength, its political traditions, and critically, the quality and vision of its leadership all profoundly shape its foreign policy.
The source points to India's political traditions of peace, truth, and nonviolence, influenced by figures like Gandhi, as contributing to its historical insistence on peaceful settlement of international disputes and its advocacy for disarmament.
And India's determined stance against what it saw as discriminatory nuclear treaties, like the NPT and CTBT, was guided by a principle, a nuclear weapons-free world, but not one that perpetuates the advantage of existing nuclear powers. That principle was rooted in its political tradition and sense of fairness.
The quality of leadership is highlighted as especially crucial. Effective leaders can accurately perceive national interests, formulate coherent strategies, rally domestic support, and skillfully navigate the international landscape.
The source lists examples: Nehru's vision for non-aligned India, Wilson's idealistic push for collective security, Churchill's determined wartime leadership, or Lal Bahadur Shastri's quiet strength during a challenging period for India.
Contrast these with leaders whose policies, based on flawed perceptions or reckless ambition, led to disaster, despite perhaps initially framing their actions as being in the national interest. Hitler, Mussolini, Yahya Khan, whose policies contributed to the breakup of Pakistan, or Saddam Hussein.
These examples underscore how the individuals at the helm, their judgment, their ideology, and their relationship with powerful domestic groups or their own regime's imperatives can define and sometimes fatally misdefine the national interest being pursued.
This is where that focus on political leaders shaping the definition of interest becomes most vivid, isn't it? Is the policy truly for the long-term welfare and security of the nation, or is it serving the short-term interests of the ruling elite or party?
And the source implicitly favors democratic regimes in the long run, suggesting they are ultimately more effective because they are more likely to base policy on genuine public welfare.
While despotic regimes, though capable of swift action, often lead to eventual chaos due precisely to distorted perceptions of interest driven by the leader's own self-preservation or ideology. That's the argument presented.
Other factors mentioned under this determinant include the perception of the ruling elite itself, their biases, experiences, ideology, the imperatives of state building, especially for newer nations, and the specific ideologies of the dominant political parties.
All feeding into the mix. Sixthly, military strength. This is perhaps the most obvious determinant, having a direct and immediate impact on a country's foreign policy capabilities and choices.
Yeah, you can't really ignore the size of the military budget or the sophistication of the weapons.
A state with large, well-equipped, modern armed forces has a fundamentally different set of options than one with a weak military. Military strength provides deterrence, it can discourage potential adversaries, it provides coercive capability, the ability to threaten or use force. It strengthens the state's bargaining position in negotiations.
Militarily superior countries are generally able to pursue bolder, more ambitious policies aimed at maximizing gains or shaping the international system to their liking, whereas weak countries must often adopt more cautious policies focused on minimizing disadvantages.
But again, the example of Israel is relevant here. While it has a strong military, its initial success wasn't solely due to size. The source implies that enlightened leadership, high national morale, strategic acumen, these can, to a degree, compensate for smaller military size compared to potential adversaries.
So, military strength is essential, but it's not the only component of power or the sole determinant of policy success.
Exactly. Seventhly, public opinion. This determinant has become increasingly significant in the modern era. Foreign policy is no longer solely the domain of kings and small cabinets meeting in secret.
Not anymore. With mass media, instant communication, and the rise of democracy, public opinion can be a powerful force that policymakers simply have to take into account. They are, by necessity, sensitive to the mood of their populace.
The source gives some compelling historical illustrations of public opinion forcing policy changes or even governmental crises. In 1935, British public annoyance over a secret deal their foreign minister, Sir Samuel Hoare, made with Italy regarding Ethiopia contributed significantly to his resignation.
And in 1957, widespread public opposition in Britain to the Suez Adventure, the attempt by Britain and France with Israel to regain control of the Suez Canal from Egypt, was so strong that it contributed to the collapse of the Eden government.
In India, for decades, fear of alienating the significant Muslim minority community influenced the government's decision not to establish full diplomatic relations with Israel, despite other potential national interests that might have suggested otherwise.
And, famously, powerful public opposition in the United States to prolonged involvement in the Vietnam War significantly constrained presidential foreign policy and ultimately contributed to withdrawal.
And more recently, American public opinion regarding the Iraq War launched in 2003 also played a role in subsequent policy debates and electoral politics. These examples show that while foreign policy elites might have their own strategic calculus, they cannot completely ignore the sentiments of the people, particularly in more open societies.
Public opinion can act as both a constraint and sometimes a driver for foreign policy.
Lastly, and described as one of the most important determinants, is the international milieu. The broader international system, its structure, its norms, its major actors, the prevailing issues of the day. This constitutes the environment within which states must operate, and this environment profoundly shapes their choices.
Apodori captures this, stating that the complexity of foreign policy comes from the constant interaction between states pursuing their own national interests and their resulting attitudes towards international issues, all within the context of the existing international community.
And states operate in a system where they lack sure means of controlling others. They can persuade, offer incentives, threaten force, but as the source says, they cannot be certain the state will act in the way it desires. This uncertainty in the actions of others make the international situation a powerful determinant.
Consider historical international milieus and how they shaped policies. The 19th century balance of power system, for instance, heavily influenced the foreign policies of European states, pushing them towards forming complex alliances, creating buffer states, engaging in arms races, relying on the concept of a balancer power to prevent any single state from dominating.
The interwar period, 1919-1939, was shaped by the legacy of WWI, particularly France's desperate quest for security, alongside the rise of aggressive expansionist ideologies in fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, militarist Japan. This milieu forced states to adopt foreign policies focused on collective security, like the League of Nations, however ineffective, appeasement, as we saw with Britain, or forming new alignments. The U.S. even changed its policy towards the USSR, officially recognizing it in 1933, partly because the shared threat posed by Hitler's rise created a common interest that overrode previous ideological hostility.
And Japan's aggression in Manchuria in 1931 also created a new dynamic that forced other powers to reassess their policies in Asia.
Perhaps the most impactful international milieu of the 20th century was the Cold War, 1945-1990. The bipolar structure of the world, dominated by the rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, directly affected the foreign policy of virtually every country on Earth.
You couldn't escape it.
Pretty much. Fear of the U.S. nuclear monopoly in the immediate post-war years influenced Soviet consolidation of control in Eastern Europe. The entire U.S. policy of containment, the formation of NATO, SEATO, these were direct strategic responses to the perceived threat of Soviet expansion.
Even the procedural dynamics of international bodies, like the frequent use of the veto in the UN Security Council, were often a direct result of Cold War politics.
Absolutely. And the Cold War's impact on countries like India is particularly illustrative.
Yeah.
The adoption of non-alignment as a foreign policy was a direct response to the pressures and dynamics of that bipolar world. It was a strategy designed to preserve autonomy.
Later shifts in the Cold War milieu also had profound impacts. The detente and rapprochement between the United States and China, culminating in Nixon's visit in 1972 and China's admission to the UN, that fundamentally altered the global strategic landscape.
Hugely. Many countries had to rapidly reappraise and adjust their foreign policies in light of this new U.S.-China dynamic. The source highlights the immediate outcome of the emerging U.S.-China-Pakistan strategic alignment following the 1971 Bangladesh War. It spurred India to sign the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation in 1971, solidifying ties with the Soviet Union as a counterbalance, a direct reaction to the changing milieu.
Beyond the Cold War, other international events have significantly shaped foreign policies. The partition of British India in 1947, creating India and Pakistan, instantly generated a hostile relationship between the two states that has forced India to allocate massive resources to defense over decades. A clear, lasting impact.
And the role of international organizations and world public opinion, mediated through global media and forums like the UN, is increasingly powerful. The source sets examples of state actions that provoked strong global reactions. The Suez Crisis in '56, U.S. intervention in Vietnam, Soviet actions in Hungary and Czechoslovakia.
The Bangladesh crisis, Cuban Missile Crisis, Soviet occupation of Afghanistan.
Right. Such strong negative reactions from the international community and global public opinion can constrain states, legitimize counteractions, and compel adjustments in foreign policy. States don't operate entirely immune to global judgment anymore.
More recent conflicts reinforce this. The Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s impacted numerous regional and global policies. Iraq's aggression against Kuwait in 1990
triggered a massive international response. The UN Security Council authorized a U.S.-led coalition to use force, supported by broad world opinion, compelling Iraq to surrender and withdraw.
This contrasted sharply with the 2003 U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, based on claims of WMDs, which lacked explicit UN authorization and generated significant global resentment and opposition, even among traditional allies.
Only Britain provided major support among big powers. These events forced many countries to reassess their policies regarding the use of force, the role of the UN, and their relationships with the involved powers.
These varied examples really underscore how the international milieu, the prevailing power dynamics, alliances, threats, economic conditions, norms, global opinion, is a constantly interacting force that states cannot ignore and which fundamentally shapes how they define their interests and the policies they adopt to pursue them.
It's the stage on which everything else plays out.
Before we wrap up, the source briefly touches on an idea held by some scholars that equates foreign policy entirely with international relations.
Yes. And it's important to note that this source explicitly distinguishes between the two. Foreign policy, in this framework, is not a synonym for international relations.
Rather, the broad field of international relations, the study of all interactions between states and other actors on the world stage, is conducted through the foreign policies of the different countries involved.
And those foreign policies, as we spent this time exploring, are themselves shaped by the complex, dynamic interaction of all those numerous internal and external determinants, from the static elements like geography and history to the more changeable factors like leadership, public opinion, and the ever-evolving international environment itself.
It's a crucial distinction. International relations is the stage and the play. Foreign policy is the script and actions of a single actor on that stage,
written based on their goals, capabilities, and perception of the other actors and the setting. Yeah, that sums it up well.
Okay, so why, after this deep dive into definitions and determinants from a textbook, does this framework matter to you listening right now? How does this connect to your experience of the world?
Because understanding this fundamental structure that states act based on perceived national interest, using the means of power, within a context shaped by a complex web of factors, provides you with a powerful analytical lens. It helps you move beyond simply observing global events to understanding the underlying why.
Absolutely. The next time you read a news headline about, say, a country signing a controversial energy deal or deploying troops to a border or taking a strong stance against a resolution at the UN, you can start to apply this framework. You can ask, what is that country's likely perceived national interest driving this action?
Is it security, economic gain, maintaining regional influence, maybe something else? What determinants might be particularly influential here? Is it about protecting vital trade routes? Geography?
Yeah.
Is it linked to securing resources, economics? Is it driven by the ideology of the ruling leadership?
Is it a reaction to a shift in the international milieu, perhaps a rising rival, a new alliance forming, or pressure from global norms? And what means of power are they using? Is it diplomatic influence, economic leverage, or military coercion?
It provides a sophisticated structure for thinking about state behavior, making the world feel less random, less arbitrary, and, well, more comprehensible. It's about seeing the strategic logic, the constraints, and the motivations beneath the surface of the headlines you see every day.
So to bring it all together from our deep dive, foreign policy is the structured way states interact, fundamentally driven by the relentless pursuit of their perceived national interest.
National interest is the core goal, primarily security, economic welfare, and a stable international order. Though perceptions of it can sometimes be tragically flawed, particularly when influenced by leadership or internal politics.
Power, encompassing authority, influence, and force, is the essential means used to achieve these ends.
And both the definition of those ends and the choice of means, leading to the specific foreign policy adopted, are shaped by a constant, complex interplay of numerous factors, ranging from enduring elements like geography and history to dynamic forces like leadership, public opinion, and the ever-changing international environment.
It's a delicate balancing act, isn't it? A continuous process of adaptation based on a state's internal realities and the external world it faces.
Absolutely.
Here's a final thought for you to ponder, something to keep in mind the next time a major international news story catches your eye. If, as we've discussed, national interest is the ultimate driver, and the definition of that interest can be shaped or even potentially manipulated by political leaders or powerful domestic groups, how does that complicate the idea of a uniform, objective national interest?
Good question. Can there really be one single interest for a diverse nation?
And in a world increasingly facing global challenges that require unprecedented international cooperation, climate change, pandemics, economic crises, how does this seemingly inherent foundational drive for individual national self-interest sometimes act as a profound obstacle to achieving the necessary collective interest of humanity?
That tension between national needs and global needs,
Yeah.
it's huge.
It's a tension that defines much of the global landscape today. Something to think about.
A question well worth considering as you engage with the world.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the fundamentals of foreign policy and national interest. We hope this framework proves valuable in your own understanding of global affairs.
Until the next deep dive.